In this session, we are going to take a look at the U.S. economy at a high level. If you recall, we said that there are three fundamental questions that economists ask. One is what to produce, meaning the composition of goods, how much medical care, how much education, how much entertainment, travel, and so forth, how much food, how much housing, transportation, etc., etc. So these are the kind of choices that societies need to make in terms of the composition of the goods, so that essentially you have the economic pie, and then it is divided between, food and shelter, let's say education, etc., etc., and so forth. The next question is how to produce, and this has to do with the issue of technology, or we call it supply side production. The first question had to do with demand side and consumption. And then finally, for whom to produce. This is a question of distribution. How do we, once we decided what is the composition of the economy in terms of economic pie, who gets how much of it, and so forth. And these are the sort of questions that every economy has to answer. Now, in terms of what to produce and how much to produce, we want to measure that. And the way that most economies, including the U.S., measure the amount of goods and services produced is called gross domestic product. Often you hear it as a GDP, and often also referred to as money or nominal GDP, and this is essentially dollar value of all final goods and services produced in a period, usually a year, but we also have quarterly information that is also gathered and revised and so forth and so on. And this essentially has two components. GDP has physical goods and services, multiplied by prices. So we have physical number of cars or houses multiplied by prices, and shoes and shirts and watches and so forth, and that gives us the dollar GDP for the US, around $16 trillion as of recent. And the only issue we have with this is that sometimes we don't have maybe small increase in output, but much larger increase in prices. So it basically doesn't reflect that we are better off, except that whatever we produce is priced higher. Let alone situations where, like in post-2007, 2008, the physical quantity of goods and services actually shrunk, and the prices actually nudged up a little bit. So in essence, we had overall some reduction in the GDP, but most of it was in the form of a lower amount of goods and services available. So for that reason, to make sure that what we're measuring is more or less free of higher or increasing prices and more reflects the actual amount of goods and services produced, we have another measure called real GDP. In this case, we basically deflate the nominal GDP by some index, and by doing so we take the change in prices out of the picture to give us a better sense of actual physical goods and services produced. This sometimes is not enough of a good information because let's say you have a country like China, around 11 or 12 trillion dollars worth of GDP, and yet they have 1.5 billion people. So if you take this pie and divide it by 1.4 billion people in terms of head count, you don't get much. That's called per capita GDP. In comparison, let's say US is roughly 16 trillion GDP, and we have a 330 million population. So you would clearly imagine that per capita GDP in the US will be higher. If you go to countries like Denmark or Switzerland, they have not nearly as much of the output, and yet they have much smaller population, so their per capita GDP is higher, reflecting perhaps a higher standard of living as a result. So these are different ways to think of the output of a country and how we measure it and so forth. Now, of course, production of this GDP doesn't capture everything. In fact, it could be exaggerated. For instance, if you have a hurricane and houses are damaged, or tornadoes and so forth, and we go in and put those houses back together, those are all additional goods and services produced, and yet all we have done at best is to replace what was damaged. Or you have a car accident, you repair a car, all the labor material that goes in the production of repair is counted as a new output, and yet all we have done is replace the old car back together. There's no new car on the road. And also, when we produce goods and services, we also produce bad along with it, such as pollution, environmental damage, etc. And we don't have a way of going back and subtracting the economic bads from economic goods. So therefore, the GDP may not truly reflect the overall welfare or prosperity and health of an economy because of those shortcomings in measurement. That's why in recent years there some conversation about coming up with a different measure of economic activities that would reflect happiness and satisfaction of the population, not just simply access to goods and services, because now evidence suggests that we can produce all kinds of stuff and people are not necessarily more satisfied with their lives, and so we need to rethink. Now, if you go to a very poor society where they don't have even proper drinking water, obviously that's important. But once you have most of everything you need, from that point on, additional stuff that people buy and put in their houses and closets doesn't generate additional happiness, and we need to kind of rethink as to what we produce and how it contributes to the social welfare of the population. Now, when the goods are produced, some of it goes into hands of households, and that's called household consumption. So these are the goods and services that goes in the hands of the consumers. For the U.S., about 70% of all the goods and services end up in the hands of the consumers. Or some of these goods and services could be in a form of investment. So you have business investment, goods and services, and that, of course, roughly is about 13-14% of the economy, sometimes more, just because the economy is rebounding and firms are investing more, and sometimes they're contracting and not even replacing the bridges and factories and office buildings and so forth, and there's a rundown, in other words. And then you have, of course, the state and local government state and federal expenditure on goods and services, about altogether roughly 20% of the economy. And then you have what we call net export, which is our export minus imports. And for the US, it tends to be import is bigger than the export, so usually is a negative number, about, let's say, roughly 4%. And now we say, well, how is it possible that we import more and export less? Is it contraction? Yeah, and then how do we pay for this? We'll pay it in the form of IOUs, or give them the dollar, and they can go and spend the dollar wherever else they want. But we have managed to maintain an environment in which we import more than we export, and yet if many countries did that, they will be gone a long time ago, and yet this is not happening with us, just because people are willing to accept IOUs in exchange for the stuff that they ship to us. So now the economy has changed in terms of how we produce things. Well, we produce farm products, more farm products with a lot less workers. So the nature of the technology of farming has changed. We used to be a little bit more manufacturing than we are currently. Here is, let's say, composition of the U.S. economy in 1900. Large percentage of the population worked in farming, so the farming was very large, and we didn't have much of anything else really. And now the farming has been down to 2% of the economic activities in terms of employment and so forth, and yet overall the economy has grown. You can see that practically is more than doubled in this 100 years. The manufacturing used to be about 22% and now is down to 20%. The government has grown almost double in the form of government expenditure on medical care for the elderly, Medicare, Medicaid, military expenditure, etc., and other forms of transfer payments such as food assistance and medical assistance for the poor, etc. So the government has grown. The agriculture in terms of employment has shrunk dramatically. The output is higher, but in terms of employment, so we have basically moved away from more labor intensive into a more capital intensive type of environment. And of course, another question is distribution. You have heard much conversation about income inequality. You also might have heard that the middle class, that used to be the largest portion of the population, is now down to 50%, which means that some people have managed to go into the high income and some people have managed to, or have fallen through the cracks into a low income. So the middle class is now smaller than it has been for quite some time. Very interesting and alarming development, because we were boasting the world with our ability to produce the largest middle class in the history of mankind, and now that has shrunk. So the question is, when we produce this pie, will a larger and larger percentage of it goes into a smaller and smaller segment of the population, what we are as referred to as top 1%, and then the 99% of the population is now getting a smaller and smaller fraction of this economic pie. And so there's a lot of debate and conversation about this phenomenon and what needs to be done, if anything. There are countries like Scandinavian and Northern Europeans that they have a much better distribution of income. They have a very large middle class, and they tax the wealthy significantly, and at the end of they have something to boast about, meaning in terms of social stability and less tension and less conflict and so forth. And so we are looking at this income distribution in a very intense way in recent years, as the data is showing that income inequality is expanding. Okay, and then of course, how do we produce these things in the form of a large corporation, small corporation, proprietors, etc. That is also over time is changing as well. The role of government, as we said before, is also changing. The government is also interested in protecting the consumers, making sure the products are safe, and government spending on public health and on environmental control issues, that type of thing. Government is also interested in making sure that the workplace is safe and workers are not subject to harmful environment or poor working conditions, and of course overall protection of the environment is something that we have come to the conclusion that it cannot be left to the individual producers. Somebody needs to have an oversight in terms of environmental quality. And so at the end we need to have a very reasonable, balanced distribution of output. We need to make sure that people are engaged, are employed gainfully, their productivity is increasing, and productivity is essentially output per hour of labor. You can improve that by more capital investment. That gives every worker more tools, better tools, more advanced tools, so that they can produce more goods and more high-valued goods and so forth. Productivity had been growing for many years, until recent years that numbers show that we are having difficulty improving labor productivity. Partly has to do with the fact that we need to educate and re-educate the labor force, produce higher quality of labor in terms of their skill and education, while we give them access to better and more advanced tools to work with. And so we have tax policies, transfer policies to make some improvement in distribution of wealth around, but obviously there's ample evidence that we need to do more work in that area. This is an overview of the economy. Of course, we had talked about production possibility curve or frontier. When the economy is improving, this frontier obviously is going outward. When the economy is shrinking, the pie is shrinking, then you have this frontier shifting inward, and that essentially means unemployment. When the economy is shrinking, people lose their jobs, and unemployment is on the rise. When the economy is going back to its potential and then in fact growing, then of course that is usually associated with low unemployment and economic growth. I hope you find this conversation helpful.